Hello for the fourth and final segment in this orientation to American politics, which is just to give you a sense to reflect on the nature of a democratic society with complex political issues and what that will mean as we try to study effectively and develop means for being strategic players when we're in an actual class setting of Public Policy 202. So part four, what I call here the foundations for the institutions and processes that we examine in Public Policy 202. One of the things about the United States, and somewhat reflected in the normative discussions I've been presenting over the last two parts, is there is a complex understanding among the public about how they think about government. Uh, Larry Jacobs and Bob Shapiro, among others, in doing their public opinion surveying on many of these issues, I've ascertained that there's a kind of tension among the public in general when you put all these things together. On the one hand, there's a strong, what they call philosophical conservatism among the American public. And we've seen that in the extent to which there is a resistance towards a too active of government, that they're really skeptical of government, that people want to pay low taxes. They don't want the government interfering in their lives, generally speaking. Particularly on the economic front, I should say. But there's a mix with what Jacobs and Shapiro call practical liberalism. And what they mean is that people in the end actually like a lot of things the government does. So if you ask them about various programs, the Medicare program, the insurance program, health insurance for senior citizens and long-term disabled, or environmental protections, or various kinds of programs to help promote economic opportunity, or even the post office, the postal service now, get pretty high support from the public. So when there's actual concrete things that people have in hand that they recognize, they're pretty supportive of those in what we might call this liberal direction, this kind of practical liberalism given what's actually happening. But there's also, as Jim Morone has written about, a divide between individualism, which we see a lot of, and those international data where I showed how there's a strong individualistic orientation among Americans compared to other countries, is also mixed in his work with a sense of community. It's not as though people want to live in their bunker all by themselves and they don't pay any attention to anybody else. It kind of goes back to the, this is an old standby notion that many of you may recognize who are from the United States, which is the notion of a barn raising. When a family in the 1800s needed to build a barn, they didn't do it on their own. Their neighbors came and helped them build the barn. There is a strong sense of community in those terms, but also a strong sense that community can do things on their own. They don't need outside experts coming in and telling them what to do or how to do things. So there are these two tensions going on in the philosophical background. Uh, this in part goes way back and is and contributes to the constitutional design, what we call the separation of power system in the United States and how it's interpreted. And we're going to dive into this more in the class. And I've argued elsewhere, this reflects four paradoxes. On the one hand, this ethos of individualism, but mixed with the call to community. So they want government that can do something, but very concerned about it. Distrust of activist government mixed with support for government benefits, that philosophical conservatism versus the practical liberalism. A wish for presidential leadership mixed with a fear of presidential overreach. And President Trump took this in ways well beyond anyone else when he said Article 2 of the Constitution, which sets up the executive power, allows him to do, gives him the right to do anything he wants. It's not actually an accurate constitutional interpretation, but a sense of empowering the president to do things to take on society's problems, but at the same time, people are really worried about what government will do and what presidential presidents will do with power. And also in demand in some ways for a responsive bureaucracy. They want the bureaucracy to be responsive to elections, to what people want, but also with a desire for there to be a competent public service that actually works and promotes the general welfare over the long term. So we get a complicated constitutional arrangement in the United States. In fact, many people underscore that we in the United States fragment government authority more than other countries do. And this creates what are called many veto points, or places in which policy actions can be blocked. Uh, Edward Corwin, a long ago major political historian, presidential scholar, talked about the Constitution as an invitation to struggle. This is a real contrast with many parliamentary systems, like the one in the United Kingdom or in Canada or in Japan and various other places around the world, where there is particularly places like the United Kingdom and New Zealand, it's not an invitation to struggle, it's an invitation to work and have the majority party succeed and move things forward and get things done without a lot of pushback until the next election comes. Our system in the United States divides power and makes it more difficult. Now, another thing that's important is what's called the mobilization of bias. This comes from E.E. Schatzsnyder long ago, and it's really about private power, the organization of private interests in the United States, and the advantages that certain private interests have over others, particularly, for instance, corporate interests. And when you take that private power and you put it into an open system that has a lot of veto points, you get the opportunities for interest to protect themselves from government action. And this is something we talk about all the time in recent years, for instance, about whether or not the tech industry has become too powerful. And is it even possible for government to be able to do things without the tech industry having the political weight to prevent those things from happening? All of this results in a government that is far larger and more intrusive than libertarians like, a social welfare state of health insurance, education, housing, and so on, that is smaller and much less effective than liberals or progressives would like, and a presidential grab for power, because there are a lot of constraints on what presidents can do, and yet they're expected to solve economic problems, or expected to solve social problems. And so there tends to be an overreach at times by presidents to try to get more power than they actually have constitutionally. Now, big government in the United States is widely decried. Almost every Republican president has talked about the horrors of big government. Government's too big and intrusive. Even Bill Clinton, the Democrat elected in 1992 after the shellacking the Democrats had in the 1994 congressional election by Republicans, came out and said the era of big government is over. Well, the United States has never really had big government in the way that we tend to think about it. Let's take the number of people who work for the federal government. Now, between 1946, when this chart starts, and 2006, where it ends, the population of the United States had more than doubled, from 141 million to 300 million. What about the number of federal employees as the population of the country doubled? Flat, basically flat. There was growth in government, but it was primarily at the state level, and in particular at the local level. So where government employment really exists is at the state and local level. Now, Paul Light, who has studied these issues, has argued that that's because we do so many, this goes back to how we do policy issues, which I'm going to get to. We do so many things using federal law and federal money, but the actual people who carry out that work are people who are in local government and state government, or in private companies under contract with government. And so he says the true size of the federal government, including what he calls the shadow of government, of non-federal employees working under federal contracts, grants, and mandates to state and local governments, is about 17 million, not just over 2 million people. So it's a little depends on how you define things. But again, this goes to the issue of what does government actually mean, and who's doing the actual work, and therefore who can be held accountable and how. This just shows the percent of the workforce employed by government. And again, as the population has grown, as the therefore the number of employees in the country has grown, the percent who are federal employees has gone down significantly from the mid-1950s on. States got bigger and kind of plateaued. Local governments got a lot bigger in terms of employment and also plateaued. Now, here's the overall percent of the workforce employed by government. Okay, it's gone up. It kind of went up in the 70s, and now it's come back down to, by the end of this chart, it was kind of back where it was in August of 1960, Why is that interesting, or why is that important? Because soon after 1960, the federal government became much more expansive. We had the Medicare program, we had the Medicaid program. These are the two of the three biggest spending programs at the federal level in the United States. Children's health insurance program, the Affordable Care Act, which brought in another 20, 25 million people into the insurance rolls, a lot with federal government support and some state support. Expansions of Social Security, the kind of public pension program, if you will, for people over age 65, where everybody gets some income support. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, Title IX program that really expanded opportunities for women in the society. The Economic Opportunity Act that had many components of trying to tackle poverty. The Model Cities program, which was another intervention of federal funding to try to improve the poverty situation in cities. The Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, hugely important roles of the federal government in expanding rights. The establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, the Americans with Disabilities Act, all these major social policy changes starting around the 1965 and into the 1960s, and we're flat basically in government employment as a percentage of the overall workforce. So really strange things are going on there in a sense that these activities of government are not necessarily being done by formal public sector employees. Now, Donald Trump back in 2017 had a tweet, as he's had a lot of tweets, in which he said, "We are the highest taxed nation in the world." And my guess is, and I'm sure gotten some opinion data on this, but my guess is that much of the American public earnestly believes that we are the highest tax country in the world. What's the true answer? True or false? False. Not by any measure and not by a long stretch. These are data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which has basically all the other democratic advanced economies in the world, plus some newer economies moving in that direction. And let's take 2014. Well, let's look in the United States first, sorry. And what we see that from 1997 to the estimated 2016, I haven't been able to update these recently. Basically, in the United States, when you look at tax revenues as a percentage of the economy, and it's all government tax revenues, federal, state, and local, about a third of the GDP is captured in government revenues in the United States, fairly consistently, with some bumps up and down. Let's compare that to other countries. I'm going to choose the year that was the last one that was most secure in the data, and as opposed to estimates going forward. And in this case, it was 2014. Compare the United States to other countries. Well, first of all, we see that the European countries, on average, had their tax revenues represented about 47% of their economies. Take a country like Denmark, which has a very robust social welfare system. Almost 6 out of $10 of the economy passes through as tax revenue. Of course, they get a lot in return for that in terms of government programs, but it's hugely different from the United States. Now, there are other countries close to the United States. Australia, it's fairly close. Japan and Korea, South Korea, Switzerland are all pretty similar to the United States, although the United States is really at the lowest end. And in particular, this misses something that's important to note, which is when you look at defense spending, military spending, the United States spends more than anybody else in the world, and therefore has to collect revenues to finance that. In the United States, this is in 2018, it's about $350 billion a year. It's about $650 billion a year. And that's been around 3.4% of GDP, which is a big drop actually from past decades. And even fairly recently, it's been as high as 4.5%. But compare that to all the other countries. Take all of the OECD all together, and it's about $350 billion, even though they're put all those countries together, there's more population. And they only spend roughly 1 to 2%, sometimes a shade more, of GDP on military defense spending. And so the United States is really devoting a lot of its government enterprise to defense, to the military. And that means that when you look at the revenues that are being raised, a significant part of those revenues have to go to defense spending, more so than in other countries. So if you were to take out defense or make defense similar to other countries, we'd be spending really, or developing revenues really representing 30%, not 33%. We'd be at the lowest end. So the kind of the least taxed for most of what government does compared to the other advanced economies in the world. If we put it in terms of total outlays, expenditures, the percentages are higher because we run deficits. If I had up this year, we were at historic deficits this year, in part because of the pandemic, but not only because of the pandemic. And what we see, we'd be maybe at 35% of GDP being constituted by public sector expenditures at the federal, state, and local level. So we are far from the biggest government in terms of a percent of the economy, far from the highest tax. We're at really the lowest tax major country, or even medium country in the world. And so Donald Trump simply got that part of the quiz wrong. There's also an unusual character to what we do with our public sector and how we do public sector programs, particularly in the domestic welfare sphere. You might think we'd be doing a lot more. This is income inequality in the United States from 1980 on to roughly the present. And what we see is that most of the income levels have had growth in their incomes lower than their per capita GDP growth. There's been a huge increase in income going towards the top 0.01%, a very significant increase for the rest of the top 1%, and the bottom 50% has hardly budged. If we look at income at the very top, again, similar kinds of data, we find that 19% in 2012, 19% of the income in the United States goes to the top 1%, and total over 4% goes to the top 0.01%. And that is bringing us back to similar patterns that we saw in the 1920s, early 1930s, early 1920s, when there was the major economic boom in a near totally unregulated economic world that ultimately then crashed in the Great Depression, and the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression lasting well into the 1930s. So our income inequality is kind of back to what were called the robber baron age of the United States. All right, let's look at what happened to the top 1% in comparative sense. Much greater share goes to the top 1% in the United States and most of the other countries we think about as being our competitors at this comparable democratic advanced economies like Britain, Canada, Sweden, Australia, South Korea, Norway, Finland, France, Italy, New Zealand, Switzerland, Germany, Japan, Denmark. Where we are is similar to Russia. Which is hardly thought to be an equitable, free market democratic society. And so we have a similar kind of income pattern now. Here's the kicker. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality in a society. And the more inequality there is, the higher you are in the Gini coefficient. This chart, as I have it now, shows income inequality according to the Gini index across a number of OECD countries. And what's interesting is the United States pre-tax, pre-government transfers is not all that different. In fact, in many ways, is better off than populations in other countries. But what happens when you look at after tax, after government transfers, and the effects of those redistributive programs and a more robust social welfare state? Now you find, after taking all those things into consideration, the United States has the greatest inequality of this collection of OECD countries, including the big ones like Germany and Britain and Canada. And so we are simply not using government domestically to do the same things to mitigate income inequality that happens in other countries. And so the question is, why is that? And it goes to all the issues I've been talking about in the other parts of this orientation, and that we will be talking about as we get into really discussing American political institutions and processes. Just to show you wealth, similar kinds of patterns, top 1% in terms of wealth, assets that people have, net wealth, they're doing much better. The bottom 80% has dropped in recent years in its share of wealth. And now the wealth distribution in the United States is very similar to Russia and China, as opposed to France, for instance, and Great Britain in the European setting. Here's what's also interesting. This is a work done by Jacob Hackert in a book called The Divided Welfare State. And what he's trying to really examine and understand across these many countries is the relative role that the welfare state has in each of the countries and how it is done. This is looking at social welfare expenditures as a percent of GDP in 1995. Excluding education. And we see one, there's significant variation. And the other thing we see, and it's not surprising given what I've just been talking about, that the United States has the lowest spending per GDP for social welfare programs. And it would be true today as well. It hasn't changed all that dramatically. But here's what's important. That's direct government expenditures. What if you add in after-tax public expenditures and the private social welfare expenditures as a percent of GDP? Okay, let's do that. Now what you find is a very significant part of what happens in the United States having to do with social welfare is happening on the private sector side. And when you add in those expenditures, the United States is not such an outlier. We're just not using the direct instrument of government programs. What we are doing a lot of is supporting social welfare programs or services or benefits by enticing through the tax system private actors. So for instance, most people under the age of 65 in the United States who have health insurance, vast majority who have health, of those who have health insurance, are getting that health insurance through their employers. And their employers are providing those health benefits as an enticement to employment. The employers get to write that off as a business cost, so they don't pay taxes on the profits that go to pay or the revenues that go to pay for that. And we, in turn, as employees, get that as a part of our payment as an employee, but it's not taxed. We are not taxed on the actuarial value of that insurance coverage. So it's like free income, except that it isn't income. It goes to this particular benefit called health insurance. And there's a whole historic reason why that's the case. But that has significant implications. It's such a large part of social welfare funding in the United States is done through this indirect means in the private sector, enticed by government. It means that if you want to change the policy, you're not just dealing with government actors and government programs. You have to deal with the fact that there's a very large world out there of stakeholders in the private sector with a lot of resources and access to this fairly open, fragmented power government who may stand in the way of policy change. It also means that lots of decisions are being made that affect people's social welfare that are being made by private actors for which one doesn't really have a lot of recourse. You can't go to the legislature and say, change this, because the decision making is being made in corporate offices and human resources offices and the like among employers. And so holding all that accountable to the voter is extremely difficult in the United States compared to other societies. It also has very significant implications for the distribution of public resources. And here, let me illustrate this. We talk about tax expenditures in the United States. What are tax expenditures? They are things like what I just mentioned with health insurance, that the employer is able to deduct business expense as a business expense, providing health insurance. And we as individuals don't have to pay taxes on the actuarial value. And so those are taxes the government doesn't get for something of value. they have the same fiscal effect as a direct budget spending, as though that money is being directly specified to be spent on us for this purpose. Now, when you look at employer-sponsored health insurance in this pie chart, you see over a third of that lost revenue, which is like a direct budget expenditure, is going to the top fifth of the population in terms of the income distribution. It's as though we're saying, let's spend the most money and send it on healthcare to the richest fifth. A lot of other programs are even more so in that direction. The capital gains on assets that are transferred at death, that is money that the government is losing from the top. 65% of that money lost or taxes lost goes to the top fifth of the income spectrum. I get to deduct the interest that I pay on my mortgage insurance. That tax expenditure benefits, or 73% of that tax benefit goes to the top fifth of the income distribution. Charitable contributions, so for those who deduct on their insurance, overwhelmingly that benefits the top fifth of the income distribution. The only program, maybe not the only program, but one of the most significant programs that actually benefits the lower income people in this country using this mechanism is the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, which is explicitly targeted to those who are working, but working at low wage jobs. There, the highest fifth only gets a tiny fraction. I'm not even sure how that happens, frankly. And the lowest fifth gets over half of the benefit of that tax expenditure. So this is when you're using these indirect mechanisms to provide social services of various kinds, or social welfare services of various kinds, and you do it through private actors and tax expenditures, it has distributional consequences that are different from doing it in the normal direct government funding way, but have the same fiscal consequences for the budget. This just further reinforces the point. Most of the tax subsidies that come through tax expenditures for mortgage deduction or deduction of state and local property taxes, that goes to the top fifth. Most of the support for employer retirement programs goes to the benefit of the top fifth. It's really in many ways a government that is designed in programs that benefit the more advantaged in the society, and there are a whole host of political reasons for that, going back to the normative issues I talked about, and also the difficulties of pursuing different kinds of policy strategies given the structure of the American governing system at the federal and state and local levels, which is part of what we're going to be talking about. And therefore, what can one do if one is concerned about these issues to move in a different direction, and what kinds of constraints are there going forward? The final piece here is looking at, this is a study that looked at comparative mobility. We used to think that the United States, for all of these issues, was such a robust economy that it was the one in which people had the greatest capacity for mobility to rise from being poor or lower income into the middle class in particular, and maybe even higher. And we used to think that countries like Denmark and other Scandinavian countries so limited economic performance by high taxation that they limited mobility, and also tied to a more long-standing institutional traditional arrangements that kept people in certain kinds of occupations. What we see in the study, however, is when you look at the men in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, who are raised in the bottom fifth, and where they end up when they themselves are adults and employed in the economy, what we see is, in the United States, people who start in the bottom fifth stay primarily in the bottom fifth, or at least 40% of them do. In Denmark, men who started off in the bottom fifth, were raised as children in the bottom fifth, are much more likely to move out of the bottom fifth to a higher income category. So there is greater income mobility in Denmark than there is in the United States. And so it then raises questions about, again, the comparative advantages and disadvantages of high taxation and a robust social welfare state versus a more free-flowing some would argue maybe more innovative economy where there's less taxation, less regulation, and greater opportunity for people to succeed and kind of hit a home run if they come up with an innovative idea and move ideas forward. So that's where the kinds of tensions are. But clearly there's notions of the United States being high taxed and having the greatest mobility simply don't hold water when you put them up against the lens of comparative analysis with these other countries. And the last thing I'll leave you with is this is an analysis of partisan polarization and how that has changed over time and how it relates to income inequality. And when you put these two metrics together, which have been done by Bonica, McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal, remember Poole and Rosenthal developed that ideology scale, what you find is a very high correlation from the early 1900s to the 2000s between income inequality and partisan polarization. And we are a deeply divided society. We are deeply polarized right now. We are also very high income and wealth inequality. And the two tend to go together. And it raises big questions about how we tackle issues like inequality and structural racism and all the things that go behind inequality as well. And in a world in which we've also got this enormous partisan polarization. So those are the challenges that all of you are going to be confronting, and I try to work on in my own way, particularly focusing on healthcare and healthcare insurance and Medicare. And these are going to be the issues that we then, in the class setting, in the course setting, tackle and thinking about, well, how are these institutions actually functioning? How have they changed over time? And what does that mean for how one can be strategic at different moments to either wait for a window to arise that can allow for action, and then once a window is there, how to move through it and gain traction on some of these issues. Thank you for listening to all of this. I hope some of it's been at least a little bit interesting and motivation for really tackling these concerns going forward. I really look forward to seeing you in the winter quarter, if only through this digital means, and having real interaction as best we can in the environment of remote education. In the meantime, have a fabulous end of the quarter and holiday break, and I will be communicating with you about various aspects of how to think about and prepare for 202 as we move into this new remote environment. Thank you.